Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Read and Reread. I am Angelia, and today it is time for Friday Reads. It's a catch-up edition because I was out of town last weekend. So I want to go over the books I've been reading over the past couple weeks. If you're detecting some slight shifts in the view, there's like this tiny bit of offness in the camera setup that I'm trying to fix, and it's also we've got funny lighting today. It's kind of going light and dark and light and dark. Things are starting to get a little funny feeling in the atmosphere. There's a hurricane a brewing, for real. Hurricane Beryl is, well, we're hoping it's just going to be sort of a tropical rain event by the time it gets here, but we're keeping an eye on it. Because if you're new, I live in Corpus Christi, Texas, and that zone is sort of North Texas, northern Mexico or South Texas. Where's it gonna go? So we're waiting to see. Emma's here this weekend. We are having some family fun time and shopping for some things she needs for her new apartment because she's about to start grad school next month, and she's going to be for the first time in an unfurnished apartment instead of a student one with the student furniture. So we're kind of fun putting together some things for that. And then we need to send her back inland before whatever happens starts to happen, so she's not driving through it. Let's start in with the weekly catch-up because since there's some extra items here. TV viewing. We finished watching White Lotus. Liked it. It was better than I thought it was going to be. It was odd, off-kilter, dark humor. I didn't know where we were going with most of the plot lines, so that was like a bigger hit than I thought it was going to be. And now we have started watching season 3 of The Bear, and only seen the first 2 episodes so far, so cannot report yet on The Bear, but I'm really glad that it's back. But let's jump right on into the books, and this is looking dark as anything. I hope I can brighten it up in the editing, but we shall see. Otherwise, just listen to my voice like a beacon in the darkness. Okay, well, first of all, I will confess on a DNF, and I DNF'd Oh Pioneers by Willa Cather. I don't think it's the book's fault. I think it was me. I took a bunch of stuff with me on our trip out of town, and I wasn't sure. I was in the middle of some things, and it was a moody situation, and so this was the casualty of the event because I just wasn't engaged in this story about a family and their farm, and I don't even know. I didn't get that far. So yeah, it was a group read, and I bailed, and I just couldn't get into it. I started reading it, and I felt like I knew where we were going with the plots, and I wasn't that involved with any of the characters. So I'm not sure if it's me or the book or a combination, but it didn't work out. I am going to try again. There's going to be a reading in the same group of The Song of the Lark. I'll say, I know it was something that was in this omnibus. The Song of the Lark, and I can't remember which month it is, but I will try again, and hopefully my reading brain will be in a better place to enjoy that story. Because I have enjoyed Willa Cather before. I loved My Antonia, and I've loved some short stories, but that particular book it wasn't working. So I moved on. I brought a comfort read, which was Babycakes by Armistead Maupin. This was the 4th book in the Tales of the City series, which begins with Tales of the City. It is set in San Francisco. There's a group of friends, and they meet when they all live together in a house that's been turned into apartments that is owned by Mrs. Madrigal, Anna Madrigal. There wasn't enough Mrs. Madrigal in this book. I will say that's one problem. She's kind of in there in a couple of pivotal conversations, but I needed more Anna Madrigal in this book. But the books take place beginning in the 70s. Now we're in the 80s. So the first one takes place in the late 70s, and now up in book 4, we are in the early 80s. And it's noted on the back cover that this was the first novel that dealt with the AIDS epidemic. And in every one of the books in this series, there is a blend. It's kind of is kind of a trio blend of some wacky plots, some really funny material, and always something that's just kind of stops you short and is kind of sad or heartrending in some manner. Like at some point in the book, you're just kind of stopped short, and it's like, oh. And usually has something to do with Mouse, Michael Tolliver. And indeed, that is the case in this book. So Michael is a gay man, and he's moved into his 30s, I think, by this point in the story, and he is experiencing a loss. I don't want to give too much away. So part of the plot is about loss and grief, and just the specter of AIDS that was just kind of unfolding across San Francisco and the United States and the world, even though it was not being addressed and acknowledged and dealt with in a meaningful manner for way too long. But in the community that Michael lives in, it's inescapable, and he's working at a hotline and dealing with it in his personal life. There's some candid conversations in his friend group about losses and risks and protection and misinformation. So all of that is kind of playing out in real time when this was a new release. So it'd be interesting to go into some archives and read some reviews when the book came out, and what reviewers are saying about that. But in retrospect, it's an interesting slice from that time in history in a piece of contemporary fiction of that time. Plus, it's just a good story. And we do have our favorite characters and some wacky plots. And it wasn't as far out as a couple of the previous installments. So I did enjoy that it was just not quite so much craziness to swallow. And it really was, I thought, a good entry in the series. And it was a good comfort read for me during a difficult week to just kind of relax into some old friend characters and see what they're up to. And my brain didn't have to work too hard. So I enjoyed this a lot. Now, there was a delightful surprise in my reading week back then. This was another one from that same time period. But right before the trip, I had started reading The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. And this was a buddy read with Michael Clark. And we decided to read this. We had both recently watched Ripley on Netflix, and we were reflecting on the previous movie from the late 90s, and neither of us had ever read this novel. And so this was a surprisingly wonderful read. I'm a person that does read mystery and crime fiction, and Michael not so much. Not his favorite genre. And we were talking in our discussion, and I said I thought that this book was kind of a victim of genre discrimination, where it gets kind of put over in that category. And there's nothing wrong with, crime fiction can be really excellent fiction, but some people, if you cordon it off and you always refer to it as like, oh, this is one of the classics of 20th century crime fiction, there's a bunch of people that are going to miss out on the fact that this is just a banger of a literary novel. And it came out in 1955. If you've only seen the movies, as I had, and never read it, and you really enjoyed those, I strongly recommend this. It is fun, it is dark, it is complicated, it is beautifully written. There's so much, you can see why it keeps getting adapted, because there's so much to work with here in the settings and the characters and the weirdness of it all. So basically, it is about a young man named Tom Ripley. He's 25 years old in this book. He was that young in that old movie. He's older in the more recent. The director kind of took some liberties and changed a few things up. But he's living in New York City. He's running some kind of low-level cons and mail frauds to make money, and an unexpected opportunity falls in his lap, because he is sort of perceived to be a better friend than he really is. He's just a kind of a very passing acquaintance of this rich man's son. And the rich man, Mr. Greenleaf, wants his son to come home and quit gallivanting around Europe and come home and work in the family business. Dickie Greenleaf has no intention of doing this. He is having fun hanging out in Italy, making bad paintings, spending his trust fund, and he doesn't want to come home and go to work. And right away, I think that Tom hears this situation and thinks, well, why would anyone want to come back and do this? But he takes the opportunity to get the free trip to Italy and tells this man that he will try to persuade Dickie to come home. So off he goes. And the thing about Tom is he is sort of a mental, emotional, and physical chameleon. He can play himself the way that is advantageous to the situation, but he's not flawless. He has to think on his feet. He makes mistakes. He has to cover up his own tracks. I don't want to give away too many of the things he does, but his mentality is fascinating. The psychological study here is absolutely fantastic. And there's wonderful dark humor the way that Tom describes things from his point of view. And it's not a whodunit. We know who done it because he tells us about what he's doing while he does it. And I don't want to tell you too much of what he does, but it's bad. It's dark. And it's just so fun. And it's one of those stories where you think, how did I get swept up in kind of rooting for this person? What's going on here? And it's also a wonderful snapshot of 1955, of these Americans in Italy and some of the tensions and pressures of the time period of masculinity and homophobia and class and wealth, and there's a whole lot going on. He reminded me a little bit of Jay Gatsby. It didn't remind me of the book or the plot, The Great Gatsby, but the character and that idea of wanting to reinvent yourself and change your identity and the way that you want the world to perceive you versus, what your background or the way that you really are. I mean, all of that, I kind of thought about some of those same themes about social status and class and wealth and self-invented people and old money and all that kind of stuff. So I loved it on many different levels. Kind of the fact that there were crimes and escapades of that nature was almost beside the point of it just being a really excellent novel. So if you are not a big aficionado of mystery fiction and crime fiction, don't sleep on the talented Mr. Ripley, because it was really, really good. So this is a terrible glare here. It was a great surprise, and I really loved the reading of this book. The last one that I took along with me on my trip was one of the books that I recently received as a gift from my daughter Emma. And if you saw the video where she bought 3 books for me and it was a surprise bag, this was one of them. Stephen King's new collection of short stories, You Like It Darker. And this, again, the surprise was, there's a spectrum of experiences you can have when you read Stephen King, and almost anyone who partakes in reading Stephen King kind of has a niche or a lane of the kind of King they like, and what the good King versus the not so good King is different depending on who you ask. But I really, really enjoyed these short stories. I thought this was kind of vintage Stephen King short fiction writing that I have enjoyed from the past. And there's a range of lengths in here. There's some really, really short, super fast, kind of hit you between the eyes sort of stories. And then there's some longer ones that have more development of character. Those are some of my favorite ones. There's one rather longer novella, and the book does commit the crime of sticking the long novella that's like 150 pages in the middle of the book instead of at one end. But I did not read it in that order. I saved it and read it last. So it's called You Like It Darker, and some of it is dark. It's not that dark. I thought, oh my gosh, how dark are we talking about? It's not that bad. It's not on the par with the worst darkness in Stephen King that I have read, which is probably Pet Sematary. It's not that bad, but there is some dark stuff. The horror element is varied. We have supernatural horror in this book. We also have human horror, like evil or criminal people type horror. We have some nature horror. We have some science fiction and speculative fiction. We have a couple of stories that kind of feel sort of Twilight Zone-y. Just a nice range of Stephen King. And my favorite stories in here are the first story, which is called Two Talented Bastards, which is about a man is telling the story, a middle-aged man is telling a story. His elderly father and his father's best friend, ever since childhood, both became very successful in their fields in their 40s. One is a writer, one was a visual artist. And people have both celebrated and enjoyed, but wondered about this phenomenon for years, how these two men from a small town just suddenly hit their stride and both really burst onto the scene at in a midpoint of their lives. And there's a particular reporter who really feels like there must be something more to this. So that's the setup. I don't want to tell you any more about it to ruin the unusual progression of the story. That let's just leave it there. That one I really loved a lot. Also, my other favorites were Rattlesnakes, which is a sequel to Cujo of all things. I didn't really like Cujo. I read it when it was a new release, I think, when I was a teenager, and I didn't like it. I don't want to read about a killer dog, a rabid dog, and children. You know, it just, there was some bad stuff in there that not the kind of story it was one of those Stephen King ones that was just like, I kind of wish I hadn't read that. But he circles back to the main character in that story years later as an older man, reflecting on the things that happened in his life, both then and since then, in a really scary, creepy, supernatural story that takes place in Florida. And in case you haven't, I did not notice this. I was halfway through the book before I actually noticed. I thought that this cover was just a little kind of, I was getting Florida there, but I was thinking an island. And when I really looked at the whole cover, can you see it? Then I finally saw the alligator. And it's significant in this book. My other third favorite story is called The Answer Man. And that is the one that's gotten some press lately because Stephen King started this story when he was 30 years old, and he begins and discards half-written things, and one of his nephews was helping him clean out some old drawers or an old office at his house, and he found the story and read it and said, hey, I think there's something here, you might want to look at this one again and finish it. And so he did. So in his 70s he finished a story that he began in his 30s, and it's really good. It's about a man who at 3 points in his life has an encounter with the Answer Man, who is a dude who just suddenly appears on the side of the road with a little table. It's kind of like Lucy with the psychology booth. He just suddenly materializes and nobody else can see him, and he gives you an opportunity to ask a limited number of questions about, well, he has some rules and parameters. You better choose carefully. That's all I want to say about that. So those are my three favorites. The stories for me ranged from pretty good to really good. There weren't any total duds. There were some I liked better than others, but it was really entertaining, really diverting. And it's a long book, but it moved along very, very quickly. So I had a good time reading that. Oh, I did want to share something. There's an afterword, and I always love, he writes really great, really good forwards and afterwards. He shares a lot, in his interviews and articles and addendums to his books about the writing process, where ideas come from, his methods. He's been very candid about that. And something that he says here I thought was really interesting for all of us as avid readers. And this is the passage I want to share. He's talking about how some of the stories in this book came to him, and it really is really fascinating. He says, am I curious about the process? Since it's played a big part in my life, of course I am. I've written about writers in my fiction, and I've written about the act of writing in nonfiction, but I still don't understand it. I don't even understand why people need stories, or why I, among many others, feel the need to write them. All I know is that the exhilaration of leaving ordinary day-to-day life behind and bonding with people who don't exist seems to be a part of almost every life. Imagination is hungry and needs to be fed. And I don't know, I just love that. He goes on a little more, but I'm going to leave some of it for you to discover. But he just talks about he doesn't really know why it comes to him and he has to tell it, or why we must consume it, but it seems to be integral to our existence. And I think everybody here would agree with that. So the other book that I read this week I cannot discuss because it was for Book 2 prize judging, and that is House of Doors by Twan. And I finished it last night. So I'm on the delicious precipice of choosing a new book to start reading today. And I am still continuing with Creep by Myriam Gurba. I will confess I haven't read very much of it this week, maybe half of one essay. I've just been very fiction fixated this week. I wanted to finish the Stephen King, and then I really wanted to get this book kind of read. So I feel like I'm in a good spot. I just have one more book to read before I do my rankings, and I kind of needed that peace of mind of making that progress. So I didn't read very far, but I will be continuing with Creep, and then I have a lot of books to pick from coming up. Got some group reads, buddy reads, the thing at the library. So I need to strategize because I don't really like to read more than 2 at a time. So I need to pick out, kind of pair everything up like Noah's Ark, 2 by 2 to get through the month and read everything that I have in mind. But that's it. What have you read this week that you really loved? What do you have on the horizon? Anything you want to chime in on what I read this week? I love hearing from you in the comments. I hope that you are having a great weekend. And well, I guess it hasn't started yet, but it's getting ready to. So I hope it's a good one, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.